Hello everyone, and in this video we're going to be learning about if-else statements and loops. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I guess we should start off with asking ourselves, how do we write an if-else statement? Now the logic behind it is pretty simple. It's more of just asking, if this, then do this, else, if that's not the case, then we do something else. And the notation is pretty basic as well. First of all, I'll just make a variable. Let's call it, let's just have it as a number, 5. And then the notation is very simple. If, and then some Boolean condition here, we'll do something else. So as for bool, I'll just ask, is number greater than 3? Then, and notice we have a colon here, we will print this number is greater than 3. Now, one thing to keep note of is that in many other programming languages, the indentation is purely so that for readability, but in Python, the indentation is very important. That's how Python figure out where the blocks of code are. So if this isn't indented, then I'll get an error because Python won't see anything under the if statement. So make sure you indent it. Also note that the number of spaces in the indent needs to be the same in a block of code. So I can't just have another print statement here. The indentation needs to be consistent. Now for the else statement. We can simply write else, and then since there's no condition, we can just go on and write whatever we want here. And when we run this, we can see that result. Now, I'll just put an input here so that we can have very different inputs. And notice, like from last time, we can't just leave this here as is because this won't be a number, it's going to be a string, since inputs will always give you a string value. So I can put int around this to turn it into a number. Now, what if we want to have more than just one if condition? What if we want more? In that case, we can use the else if condition, which is just elif. Now, this works in precisely the same way as an if condition, except, well, it goes after. And we can have as many of these as we want. And we can have another condition as so. Now, by the way, these things, the double equal sign, this does not mean we're assigning a value. The double equal sign refers to saying, are these two expressions the same? And then, of course, we have greater than symbols, and greater than or equal to is simply denoted like this. Of course, there is also the not equal to, which is denoted with a exclamation mark in front of the equal sign, which just means if these two things are not equal to each other. Now, this is pretty basic, but sometimes you're not going to want to have these really big, chunky expressions. Sometimes, maybe you just want to print a value. Maybe you just want to print something, but you don't want to have a big, chunky if expression before it. Well, in Python, there are these things called ternary operators, which can be a bit complicated, but they are very handy to use sometimes since they are way more compact. So the basic formula for a ternary operator is, and this hash is how we do a comment in Python, so then it won't care about whatever you put in the line after the hash. Now, the basic way we do it is the true output and then if condition else false output. So what this means is that what we'll write is, I want you to output this if this condition is true, otherwise output this. So we can try that like this. So let's say we want to output big if num is greater than 10, greater than or equal to 10, let's say. Else, we want to output small with this same formula. Now, as we can see, if we type a number, let's say 12, we get our output. Now, notice how simple this is. We can just have this in one line, nice and compact, instead of having an if expression, which takes up a lot of space. So this is really handy. And sometimes it can save you from having to assign something to a variable as well. Now, sometimes we'll want to have more complicated if expressions. What if we want to know, we want either num is greater than 10 or this number is equal to 0. Well, we can simply use the OR statement. So this will consider that either, for an OR statement, either this expression has to be true or this expression on the right has to be true for it to output a true. Otherwise, it will be false. And we can see that we can try this. 0, it works. And for 21, let's say, it works. Now, for the next topic of this video, loops. These can be really helpful if you want to do something multiple times. Let's say you want to print something 10 times. You don't want to just have to write 10 print statements, right? So that's where loops come in. So there are two main types of loops: for loops and while loops. First, for for loops. Let's say we have let's say we want to print hello world 10 times. We can use a for loop. For, and then we need to have something here. So there's this one function which is very helpful, which is called range. Now, what this will do is if we put in range 10, I in range 10. So what this will do is for every I is just a variable that gets created for this use. For everything in range of 0 through 10, well, technically, since this is not inclusive of this index, so it'll be from all numbers from 0 to 9. This will get looped, and we'll have this to use. So if we did this, then what it's going to do is it's going to start and it's going to create this variable I, and this is just a common place to use I, stands for index. And I will get set to 0 first, and then it'll print then it'll go through the loop. Then I will be set to 1, and then it'll go through, then 2, and then so on and so forth until it gets to 9. And we see this happens here, from 0 all the way through 9. Now, for loops don't have to just loop through ranges. It can also loop through a string or an array. For a string, it'll go character by character, and for an array, it'll go item by item. If I have a word, let's say it is interesting, we could instead loop through word and have each letter, and we can print each letter. And we can see it does exactly that. Now on to the second type of loop, the while loop. A while loop is a little bit different, as a while loop will keep looping until some condition, let's just say here, as long as some condition is true. Now let's say that condition is, let's say we have, again, I for index, let's say we have I for index is equal to 0, and while I is less than 10. Now, obviously I is less than 10. And then we can do something like print I times 5. And then we can increment I so that something actually changes, so that eventually, once I becomes greater than 10, this will stop, and we can run this and see it works out. While loops can be very helpful since they can allow us to keep running something as long as a condition is met, so that we can either try to fix that condition or just repeat something a certain number of times. Now, when you use while loops, you have to be careful, since if this condition is always met, then it'll run forever and ever. Notice if I did I is equal to -10, this isn't possible. So when I do this, it'll just keep running on and on and on. Well, actually, no, sorry, not on and on and on. That's my bad. If I not equal to -10, it will never work, since I will never equal -10. So this will just keep running, and it will keep running unless I stop it, which I can just do like this. And notice this is very helpful. If you do Control-C, that will stop a program, which can be useful if you've accidentally made a forever loop. Now, sometimes you may want to make a forever loop only to break it sometimes. Now, there's this keyword called break, and what this will do is, regardless of whether the condition is true or false, it will break out of the loop. Let's say if I is equal to, let's say we have break, and we still had our I plus equals 1. Now this will keep going, but then it will eventually stop. do this break condition, even though this condition is nowhere near stopping. However, there's also the continue command. So let's say we have some names, and we have Bob, Joe, Alex, Carol, and Zan. Now, let's say we had a for loop and we were looping through all of these names, right? Well, in this case, let's say we wanted to loop through each of them, but when we got to Joe, we didn't want to print the name Joe. We wanted to print everything else. Well, what we could do is we could try to print each name like normal, but then if name was equal to Joe, then we could continue. Now, this doesn't mean we just continue going on. This means that we just skip to the next iteration and we just ignore everything else that's there. So if we run this, we'll notice that Joe doesn't get printed because when it went through, it met this condition and it just continued on to the next iteration and it never got to printing. Now, sometimes when you're making a large piece of code, you're gonna want to use this thing called pass, because notice that if I was making an outline for my code and I just left nothing here to move on, it'll give me an error since it needs something to be here. But if I put pass, then Python will just pass as if nothing has happened. So this is really useful when you're trying to make the general structure of your code before actually coding every single method. Thank you for watching this video, and remember to like and subscribe.